Over the years, there have been many attempts to make certain pieces of railway rolling stock self-propelled for one reason or another. Passenger carriages make some sense to motorise, as it means less time is wasted shunting trains on quieter lines, and goods wagons, while impractical, do have a good reason to be motorised in some niche situations. But what sense does it make, I ask you, to motorise a brake fan? Not much, to be honest. Unless you live in Brazil. In the early 1800s, coffee plants were introduced to Sao Paulo in Brazil, and it wasn't long before coffee became the state's major commodity, with Jundiaí becoming a major hub for business and trade. There was, however, the issue of exporting the coffee. While Jundiaí wasn't too far away from the port of Santos, it was almost 800 meters above sea level on the Serra do Mar mountain range. This wasn't much of a problem at first, but as business picked up, demand for a faster and more efficient way of moving the beans was needed. Naturally, a railway was proposed, but the sharp grades of the mountain meant it'd either be unbearably long or unbearably steep. Rather than wind around the mountains, a steeper, more direct railway was planned and work began on the line in 1860. The line was to be built with a grade of 8%, but instead of being one long continuous climb, the grade was split up into 4 segments, with a 75-meter long gap between them, with a platform and rails laid at a relatively level grade. Once completed, however, it was found that some parts of the line were as steep as 10.3%, and even the level parts in between the grades were laid at 1.3%. Naturally, the engineers who designed the line knew it'd be impossible for a train to climb it without assistance, which is why the line was built as a funicular. A steel cable ran up the length of each incline and ended at the platforms along the line, with a steam engine at each platform working the pulleys. The line was built to Irish broad gauge, 1,600mm, and opened in 1867, being named Serenova. In order to prevent accidents or runaways, a special brake fan which would be attached to the steel cable was connected to the wagons being towed along the line. The vans, known as Locobreques, had special brakes which clamped onto the rails should the cable break or become disconnected. A driver would ride in this van to apply the brakes if needed, as well as make sure the connection to the steel cable wasn't too tight. The system worked well and helped not only to move coffee to the port, but bring supplies and passengers up and down the mountain too. The only major issue with the design, however, was the platforms. Because of how steep the grade was, the funicular could only carry a maximum of 60 tons at a time. Naturally, carriages and trucks would be the only thing the funicular would tow, since bringing a heavy locomotive up didn't make sense. However, there was a gap between the cables at every platform along the line, meaning that when the wagons would arrive at the top of a grade, a locomotive would have to shunt them towards the next one before carrying on. Regardless, the railway continued to operate this way until 1890, when it began to struggle with the significant increase in traffic. To keep up, a second railway line was built alongside the Serenova, this one having 5 platforms along the line as well as being 10 kilometers longer to make the overall grade less steep, the incline being no greater than 8%. Named Serenova, it was opened in 1900, and though it was longer than the original line, it proved to be much more reliable. Rather than use a counterweight pulley system like the original line, the new line used an endless rope system similar to a cable car. For every load going up the line, another load of equal weight was sent down to help balance the forces of ascent and descent on the cables and put minimal amounts of stress on the engines powering them. Because of this, the load capacity of the line was increased to 120 tons. A drawback of the new system, however, was that using Locobreques to control the wagons wasn't possible, and so a new kind of brake fan was needed. Like the Serenova, there was a gap between the steel cables at every platform along the line, meaning wagons needed to be shunted from one cable to the next. And so, rather than having a shunting engine stationed at each stop, the railway decided it'd be more efficient if the brake fans were locomotives themselves. This way, time wasn't wasted coupling, uncoupling and shunting the wagons at every stop, as the brake fan could just push the wagons to the next cable and carry on. They also came with the benefit of the locomotives being able to shunt and organise the wagons at the top and bottom ends of the incline once they arrived, again saving time. 12 locomotives were ordered from Kerr Stewart and Company in 1900, with another 8 being built by Robert Stephenson and Company in 1901. These four-wheeled locomotives were fitted with a pair of 13.5 by 16-inch cylinders, 3-foot driving wheels, vacuum brakes, and special equipment to grip the steel cables with. A grabber would drop down, lift the cable up under the locomotive and into a large clamp which firmly held onto it. The engines also possessed similar brakes to their Locobreque counterparts, which, when activated, would clamp down onto the rails and hold the locomotive in place. They were built with the boiler enclosed similar to tram engines, however this body was later extended at the front to provide a space for passengers to ride in. Later modifications included fitting larger water tanks, installing air brakes, and converting them to burn oil instead of coal. Because the engines gripped the cable from below, they could be positioned at the lower end of the wagons to make sure that the trains wouldn't run away should a coupling break, making them much safer in practice than their brake van counterparts, which had to be at the top of trains so they could be connected to the steel cables. The engines were officially called the Class Z, but were mostly known as Locobreque due to their unique nature as locomotives designed for braking. Despite their unconventional design, the engines worked and helped speed up the process of moving goods and passengers up and down the line significantly. Even with this boost in efficiency, however, the line still proved to be a bottleneck for the railway, and as such alternatives were looked into. Proposals to build a rack railway came about in the 1920s, but were put on hold due to the Great Depression. Plans were picked up again in the 1960s, and by 1974 the original Serenova incline had been replaced by a rack railway. The Serenova incline remained open for a few years afterwards as the new line still had some teething troubles, but by 1982 it no longer served a purpose and was closed down. The Locobreques, meanwhile, had all been retired by 1976. Passenger services were handled by diesel rail cars, and goods wagons by this point were all fitted with either vacuum or air brakes, rendering the locomotives obsolete for emergency braking. A few engines remained on the line until the 90s, working tourist trains before finally being withdrawn. Out of the 20 Locobreques built, around 10 still survive to this day, some in better condition than others. A few of them have been cosmetically restored and are on display at various museums in Brazil, with efforts underway to possibly restore some of them to working order. Like I said at the start, motorizing a brake fan is, on its own, a silly idea, but the Locobreques show that in the right scenario, even silly ideas have practical applications. Subscribe for more.